All right, welcome to another episode of The Conscious Endeavor. Here we are, my friend Tae Kyung back in the seat. We're going to be talking a little bit more about physics, biology. I think we're going to dive into a little bit about human history and all sorts of interesting things. So strap in, put your seatbelts on, and we'll start talking. I think we were discussing actually a little bit before we started recording. We were talking about the Sumerian, what was it called?
It's something called the Silurian hypothesis.
Okay.
It's based on there was like this episode about this species called the Silurian species from Doctor Who, and some guy basically made a whole dissertation about whether or not it would be possible to find any evidence of past civilizations here on this planet that we're not aware of.
Right. Yeah. I mean, really interesting, especially in the course of human history. If we talk about the 6,000 years of allegedly recorded history, right? And that's at the peak of that civilization. It's like, okay, all of a sudden 6,000 years ago, so we had pyramids, right? But it's like, well, there's a lot of advanced mathematics involved in that. So there had to be a lead up at least, maybe of 1,000 years or something, maybe a couple hundred years at the rate that we see technology maybe exponentially increasing. Right, but there has to be some sort of lead up or something like that. And
right. One of the things that this guy pointed out was, if you look back into fossil records or soil records into the ice or the soil, you could basically kind of find when the Iron Age started for humankind. Mm-hmm. You can see a great deal of CO2 emissions that happened, at that area of time. And, if you trace it back all the way to the present day, you can basically see a trend going on with CO2 emissions going larger and larger. And, we basically assume that it's because of modernization, industrialization, and, man-made type of stuff. And what's interesting is that some of these records, or at least what the soil suggests, is that we had a similar time period about 100,000 years ago, perhaps more. And we don't know if it's natural. We don't know what was around like 100,000 years ago. I mean, even plastic takes thousands of years to degrade. But if it's 100,000 years, who knows if there's going to be any evidence to even find it again. Yeah,
and you're saying specifically in this soil sample that there was a peak in the CO2 production as well, around 100,000 years ago. Now, does it come back down as far as...
Yeah, it did.
Okay, so it went up and then came down. Mm-hmm. So in that regard, it's interesting
and
what would have produced that.
It was sort of a spike too, like a noticeable spike.
Yeah.
I wish I could show you the graph if...
we can understand the spike. I think,
right. That. Yeah.
It's interesting too, because the human, general biology, or the way our brains are now, essentially we've had that for about 300,000 years, right? So anatomically, I guess modern day humans have existed for this period of time. We've had the same general sense of biology for about 300,000 years is what we say. So imagine having, your brain, your capability to some extent, and some of that obviously is learned, right? You know what I mean? So we could say that, okay, maybe some of this learned behavior is what advanced society as well, but we still had the basic mechanics, the basic problem solving, capacity, right? So it's like, okay, well, what did the human mind do 100,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago even, right? You know what I mean? Because the scale of this country in the U.S. is like 250 years old.
It's kind of interesting how you say that because, as far as we know, we're able to, map things incredibly well with great precision. Like, I guess one thing that distinguishes us from, cognitive and sentient animals is the fact that we have a frontal lobe and things like that, And there could very well be fossilized records that, we find deep down somewhere that may have some sort of evidence to suggest, that there was something before us. Of course, this is all just theory crafting. This is all theory play,
Yeah.
But and unironically, it seems like to me, the more we learn about like ourselves, physics, chemistry, and biology, and the more questions we generally end up having,
Right.
and it's almost as a way that like you kind of see things through a very narrow lens, and when you begin to understand things, that focus or that lens becomes a little bit more wider.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way you get to pick up on things that weren't previously, I suppose, open to you in a way. Like it's kind of almost like maybe this isn't the best example, but when you read a book like 3 times or 2 times,
Right.
You're reading the same book over and over again, you have a more
Right. You start to see the symbolism maybe in the book. You start to see like deeper levels of the character development, maybe the motivations of the characters.
Yeah. Same thing with shows or movies. And
I think too,
like
it's
that.
like once we start to learn the basics of, biology or biochemistry, for example, as we understand some of the maybe mineral base of the human body. And then that, again, as you're saying, can lead to deeper questions. It's like, how do some of these operate? How do they get in it? All like the pathways involved with some of those minerals, how some of those minerals are utilized, how they endogenously come about too. You know what I mean? Our brain, our body, basically, we eat food, we synthesize those things into particular chemicals, or we separate things, for example, like raw sodium, raw potassium. These things in nature, right, are unstable, but our body, utilizes it, separates it by membrane, allows function to occur because of that, right? So it becomes kind of these, like, I guess, deeper questions in that regard.
Yeah. I find that so interesting because, there's something that you introduced me to about neuroplasticity, how synapses are literally able to rewire themselves,
right.
And a lot of the things, like that's why habits can be very, very difficult to break, because those pathways are very, very set. And I actually found this very, very interesting. When you're learning something for the first time, for instance, statistics, math, or things like that, you're actually activating more parts of those neurons firing, because they're basically trying to get the concept. And, the more it's like a muscle, the more you work on it, the more, I guess, action potential it has, and the more it fires,
Right.
And it gets to a certain point where people who do this for a living and you scan their brains, you actually don't see that many neurons firing, apparently. And I guess one of the reasons for that is because their pathways are already set up.
Yeah.
And
the brain becomes more efficient over time too. You know what I mean? So the first time you try to, create a behavior, again, there's no inherent network for that task, right? Because if you've never done it before, the body doesn't know how to do it, right? But then over time, right, the brain becomes more and more efficient at processing that information, getting that information, let's say, from point A to point B, right? If you're learning like the multiplication table as a kid, for an example, right? It's not encoded into memory, right? We start to build the neural network that associates those things. 7 times 7 is 49, right? You know what I mean? Like things like that. Over time, the more we utilize them, again, the stronger they get, the faster the brain gets at that. And the interesting thing too is that happens at the beginning of life. There's what they call neural pruning, right? Or neuronal pruning. So actually, as you get older, you have more neurons in your brain when you're a baby and a child than when you are an adult. Certain neurons die off.
Right.
The theory is that basically we get more and more efficient at the transfer of information, that certain neurons become arbitrary, right? There's a set of neurons and they all start communicating in regards, let's say like one neural network becomes very strong, a couple neural networks become very strong, the other ones that are maybe adjacent to that neuron, right? That neural pathway, it becomes arbitrary. It's not needed. It's not necessary. So it kind of, there's a die-off, what we call neural pruning, which is really interesting. And,
I see. The reason why I brought this subject up in the first place is because, the last 150 years or so, well, actually maybe not so, because the Bible was the catalyst that brought Western civilization, at least as a population, to start illiterate. Literate, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like they're able to read and, write their own thoughts and express themselves and things like that. And, the contrast to how things were 150 years ago or so to how things are now, it's astonishing how much, how many things we figured out,
Right.
And anyone that's really being born into this world basically starts from back to level one, yeah. Rebuilding their pathways, and I guess, they're not just their own identities and their own values and their own worldviews as they're developing, but also based on, if their interests were into physics, psychology, or whatever it is,
right?
And that can have a fresh perspective for them as well, And there's a show on Hulu. It's called Genius.
Okay.
And the first season is actually about Albert Einstein.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a very, very good show.
Yeah.
I do recommend it. And it's really, really, let's just say that he was built different, for lack of a better word.
Well, they analyzed his brain after his death, and they found that he had like way more glial cells, which glial cells help the metabolism of neurons.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, he had more juice essentially feeding into those neurons, allegedly, or was maybe had the ability to, I guess, support function, a lot of function from neurons.
Right.
But,
Right. Yeah. I mean, because what he did is something that very, very few physicists were able to do, even in their own fields.
Mm-hmm.
Like people like Schrödinger is well known for, his wave equation, and Max Planck did beautiful, groundbreaking discoveries and stuff like that. However, with Einstein, after he graduated from the University of Zurich, I believe. I don't know if it was the University of Zurich or the Institution of Zurich. But anyways, so he ends up basically working for a patent clerk for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And the dude's not happy.
Yeah.
So, in a way, his networking wasn't as big as we know it, from historical events and stuff. But on his way to getting there, one of the things that he did is he published basically. I think the year was 1905, where he published 4 different papers about physics.
Right.
And many of them were groundbreaking. Like the first one, he basically proved to he proved the existence of molecules, and someone later on, forgot who it was. It was called Brownian motion, but some guy tested out his theory, and turns out that he was correct, that you are able to model these molecules and the mathematical framework that Einstein proposed.
I mean, it's interesting too, as we're talking about, like, kind of in this way of like the progression of civilization or society. He was able to kind of aggregate a lot of information. He probably got exposed to a lot of information.
And it was such an interesting time in physics, my dude.
Yeah, a lot of development happening.
Like, because we had recently just discovered electricity, and maybe like 75 years ago during that time, like during the 1990s. Of course, the First World War was still going on.
1890s.
1890s.
Just to clarify.
Yeah. The First World War hasn't happened yet, of course, but but it was a time where there was so many fresh discoveries being made, and the implications over that. There were lots of different debates. Even I believe like the model for it really wasn't until Einstein who challenged, Newton's model of space-time.
Right.
And because a lot of people laughed at Einstein in a way. I can imagine, when he first tried to explain special relativity and relativity.
Yeah, I mean, imagine even 100 years back, 1790, trying to explain electricity. Right, and how things can basically operate and be charged and have power and batteries, right? These objects, which essentially, if you don't know about energy storage or electricity storage, right? Like how does this thing function? Because prior to that, we had steam trains, I guess, and things of that nature, right? Which were all powered by combustion, right? And pressure and mechanical forces,
Right.
right? Now all of a sudden going from mechanics to going into like electrodynamics, right? We're actually, the irony is like we're working with a smaller, smaller bits of matter, but yet we're getting kind of more energy out of those things, which is really ironic, if you think about it. I mean, there's kind of parallel between those two, but in terms of, again, the progression of society, it's like we continue, as you said, writing, we continue to record these things. And over time, they have that saying, we sit on the shoulders of giants, right? Because every time, it's interesting, like you pick up a book and you can read someone's life work, you know what I mean? And you can start at the point that they ended, and you can pick up knowing, what they knew at a particular point, like what they
100%.
what took their entire life to learn.
100%.
And now you assimilate that information and a couple maybe other people's information, and now you have a new starting point where you can integrate those things. And then again, society progresses in that way and, continues to grow. It's just, it's wild.
Yeah. I love that. It's almost in a way, like the natural, well, I wouldn't say natural because we live in a very privileged time, just the fact that freedom of thought and freedom of expression has become, the golden standard.
Yeah.
Things were very, very different.
Yeah, tyranny, dictatorship, kings, who limited thought, limited, again, as you were saying before, like the ability to read and write. Because when you read a book, like you're literally reprogramming your brain. Like you're just absorbing information. And like, if you couldn't read, you were basically denied that ability to essentially, like neuroplasticity on demand, it's like reading a book, right? Kind of just assimilating that information and moving forward with that information.
In a way,
really interesting.
Technology really does become the great equalizer for, at least for our own shortcomings, because you have a designer that was able to solve a problem and, almost like the internet. Like the internet is like built up of 7 different types of layers. And, you have the binary physical system, and then someone created like this whole data system. And, eventually you create layers and layers and layers upon that. And then you have something with, cell phones and things like that.
It's interesting too, because it becomes like kind of an analogy for the self.
Yeah.
In terms of the hardware of the body and then the operating system, being maybe the physiology and the neurochemicals that are bouncing around in that body, the mineral base the body has access to, and then the software, right, being the program, the user interface, right, in that regard, where it's like the psychology sits and all that stuff.
Yes. I think that's why, like, when it comes to physics and stuff, of course, it's a very, very vast subject, with lots of things to study for. And, like, you're not going to get, like, how to do a simple harmonic, how to, derive a simple harmonic motion with, like, levers and stuff like that. It takes, like, layers and levels to get there,
right?
And quite frankly, ideally, if we were able to empower people to have all their needs met, and for them to, and I guess altruistically advance, the next level of humanity or whatever through whatever field you're trying to accomplish. It's definitely a real possibility. I guess what I'm trying to say, though, is we have a force within us, a consciousness in a way, that is easily defined by our environment and our conditions and such. And yet, at the same time, when armed with I guess, a certain spectrum of looking at things in the world. It allows us to overcome our own conditioning and our own environment and our own biases, and
Right.
in a way. And physics is just one of those disciplines that allows us to understand reality, or not even understand, interpret reality
Right.
at a deep level.
Yeah.
Um,
It's interesting too, because it always kind of eventually, I mean, these systems tend to cycle back to ourselves, because again, as we understand natural reality and embodiment and things like this, we understand physics, the nature of space. It's interesting at certain levels of physics, like we have to reintegrate that idea and how it applies to, let's say, the foundation and formation of life, right? In terms of like, what are the certain forces that allow life to exist, or what forces exist within life, right? Because we know, for example, everybody knows the mitochondria, right? The powerhouse of the cell, right? But like that little thing is literally just, they have what they call the electron transport chain. So it's literally working in electricity. And electricity is occurring and being utilized, and these ionic forces, right? Or ionic being like the fact that molecules have inherent charge, right? Our body utilizes those things, and we ended up finding all these things. It's like, wow, our body, like we discover electricity as a power source, right? But then all of a sudden, when we start to reflect that back, it's like, okay, some of these systems are inherently occurring in the human body.
Kind of have a joke based on that. Don't you find it ironic that like almost all compounds are like ionic instead of covalent? It's like very rarely do you have like two elements like, oh yeah, sure, like we'll share electrons, we'll be whole, and then you just have like 99% of all the other elements like, give me that.
Yeah.
Or like, I don't know.
Well, the thing is too, is like the only thing that's technically, or as a raw material, raw atom that's, not ionic are the noble gases, right? So they're the only ones that like don't bond with anything, But it's interesting because you have this kind of attraction of opposites, like sodium and chloride, right? They're literally on the opposite spectrums of the periodic table, but they come perfectly together, and then they're balanced in nature, right? And then our body takes it, dissolves it in acid, and rips it apart.
Yeah, and there's so many levels to it too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not my field, but
yeah,
I know how deep chemistry can go, and it's crazy too. Like, if you take apart a carbon atom, right, you essentially have, like, that's what carbon fiber is.
Right, chains of carbon.
Yeah, yeah. It's like when you get down to, I guess, the nano layers of the atomic structure of carbon or whatever, it just becomes like a whole different type of, you can make it into a new thing,
Yeah. I mean, all plastics are polycarbonate, right? They're like different chains of carbon molecules.
But
right?
still carbon. Yeah.
Yeah. And the interesting thing too isn't oil carbon based? I suppose. See, because this is what, I mean, again, not our field, right? But, you have oil, and oil gets refined, and oil gets made into plastics. A lot of plastics come from oil. They refine oil to a certain, extent, and then they're able to make it into plastic, make it moldable, melt it down, combine it with other things, right? And then all of a sudden now you have this malleable material that you can form into shapes and make, water bottles or whatever the hell you want. And there's different types of plastic. Certain ones degrade, certain ones don't. But again, yeah, carbon being, and I guess we are also carbon-based beings, right? So again, the wild, kind of ness of all of that is pretty crazy.
Yeah. Just to bring it back a little bit, when I was talking about how, if you look at certain things through a lens, you can basically, see a much broader perspective in a way. And I feel like there are really two models that you start to come across. They're kind of opposing with each other. Like, for instance, to give you an analogy, you can take a look at all that we've discovered in the universe and see that we're just one small significant speck that's like really nothing, you know, in the grand scheme of things. And then on the other spectrum, you know, you have what you can define as almost a thermodynamic miracle, as, you know, it's a very, very rare thing for us to be here, you know. And so and I guess what I'm trying to say is you have the reductionist model where you break things down to its most simplest components, you know, and you use that as an attempt to explain the whole system in a way, you know, that the system in a way is like the sum of its its parts for the whole, you know. And the opposite way, maybe not opposite, but contrast to that, you do have almost a holistic approach, I would try to say. You try to take all those things, and of course, you know, they have their own little nuances and differences, like being able to, you know, combine different ideas and fields together, you know. And yeah, it's like, I guess you can basically see things in a very literal mindset, you know. You know, I would almost say I don't, not like dystopian, but like this very realistic, you know what I mean, unapologetic, like just objectively based, you know,
or objectively based.
Yeah. And on the other hand, you can try to, you know, take the view of how it's yes, there is, like, you know, this whole objective thing, but as a subjective experience, you know, you have your own experiences, you have your own perspectives.
It's interesting too, like as you mentioned, the reductionist.
Do you understand what I'm trying to say though?
Somewhat, yeah. I mean, if we were talking about like reductionist versus like another kind of paradigm, right? So one is, it's like you can be kind of everything and nothing, right? In a way that, you know, reductionism brings it down to, you know, separate pieces, pulling that apart, right? Understanding the atom by breaking down the nucleus, the electron, right? Something of that nature. But it's interesting too, if we integrate like just the idea of, as far as contrasting that to the holistic approach, right? Because for me, in a way, I intuitively would think that psychology or your own awareness is kind of a holistic approach to all of these other sciences, in the sense that, you know, chemistry is occurring in your brain, right? Physics is a product of what you've become in your form that you have, right? But when you have, let's say, an emotion in your psychology or a desire or something like that, it's a culmination of the movement of all these hormones, molecules, elements within the body.
I'm glad you said that. Yes.
We kind of sense it, right, to some degree, you know, and it's kind of like this overarching idea, like our sensations, our own intrinsic sense of awareness sits on top of all of these other phenomena, right? You know, we sit, and you mentioned, and just to bring it back a little bit, you mentioned Brownian motion that Einstein discovered, right? So Brownian motion being really interesting in the sense that the movement of molecules is chaotic, right? But when we zoom out, we actually find that the motion, it becomes uniform. So you can't predict the motion of one molecule, like in that river of molecules, let's say, its motion is completely random and chaotic and you can't predict it, right? But once you pull out, you zoom out, now the whole mass of all of those molecules are now susceptible to the larger forces of, as you said, thermodynamics, right? And all these other things. And now all of a sudden, the group of molecules becomes predictable, right? As the motion is moving this way, it's going to diffuse in this direction, right? It's going to, you know, hit, you know, whatever resistance, and we can maybe calculate the level of resistance against the voltages, right? The millivolts, right? The small amount of charge that comes about due to these things, which are, again, driving forces of these smaller bits, right? So that reductionist model maybe not being as sufficient, because, again, in reduction, we get into that Brownian motion paradox where if we look at just the one thing, it's unpredictable. It becomes chaotic. But when we zoom out, right, we have a grander application of theory and law and rule, right?
Yeah, for sure.
mean, there's different domains of physics too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's also the whole thing with like how quantum physics and, you know, classical physics
my
can't
goodness.
agree, right? You know what I mean? If we go down that rabbit hole, right, that they've been trying to get that unified theory of how these things operate, like where and how do these things actually now make sense to each other? Again, because at the quantum level, things are unpredictable. Things literally, like when we talk about quantum tunneling is the fact that literally a molecule could be somewhere, it'll disappear and reappear somewhere else, right? So we don't know how or why that occurs. And this happens in biology. They found evidence of quantum tunneling in biology where like a molecule will be moving towards a membrane, it'll literally disappear and then show up on the other end of the membrane, right? So whether or not, maybe it's the speed, I haven't read too deeply on that, but maybe it's the speed at which the membrane is able to maybe open, close, or the net ionic forces, you know, because we have, not to get too deep on this, but we have the idea of like the particle wave duality, right? That a particle, you know, can be both a wave and a finite point. So maybe if its energy is moving in a particular direction, can it maybe like subsume itself into its wave-like, you know, existence and then reparticleize, you know, in this kind of, because, you know, as physics, you know, evolves, we're talking about 0-point energy and all of these other, you know, kinds of sciences, which just get incredibly complicated. And the mathematics of that, you know, is insane.
Like my question is how are things, like, how is it that it's almost like a joke, you know? It's like biology learns physics, chemistry, once you discover that it is physics, chemistry,
right?
You know,
yeah. There's that joke that like the scientist is just a group of atoms trying to study itself.
Yeah. And then say hypothetically we get to like scale that up to like chemical stuff, you know. Then we refine that a little bit more, you know. And then like we get into biology and like, you know, things like that. Don't you think there is there becomes a point when so I guess what I'm trying to say is, do you think there comes a point where there are almost no more problems to solve?
I think that's more of like a philosophical question, because even if we figure everything out, humans are just going to make problems, you know, to be real. And also I think problems are inherently a product of our perspective, right? So let's say right now we have real problems in terms of like there are people we can't house, and there are people who can't, you know, get access to food or clean water. You know, those are real problems in terms of our, I guess, general biology. But once we maybe solve those universal basic needs, there's going to be then, you know, other things that humans focus on. Like now there's no longer that issue, right? That problem is solved, quote unquote. But now, you know, I think that it's natural for all humans to experience a range of emotions, right? So no matter what environment you grow up in, we see this, I think, in modern culture, where like something that's difficult for one person is very easy for someone else, right? Someone who calls something hardship, someone else might say, well, that's not even, you know, anything, right? Because again, there's a spectrum, right? But people who live in, let's say, a rough environment could go through maybe a rough circumstance and think it's not that bad, right? But someone else from a different perspective with a different lifestyle may think, wow, that's really difficult. So regardless of where you exist, again, even in the progression of time where you exist, if you exist 1,000 years in the future and all these alleged problems are solved, right? There's going to be other issues that there's going to be things that still make us upset and sad. And then the interesting thing is, like, are we again going to be maybe turn our problems internal? How do we get rid of sadness, right? But I think that's kind of an inherently wrong way to look at things, because I think the, you know, part of the human experience is that. But, you know, if all these external problems are solved, it's interesting to think whether or not we would almost attack the internal,
right?
You know, and say, well, let's get rid of sadness and loneliness and grief and all of these other things and make everything good all the time. But even then, again, everything good all the time, there's going to be really good and just okay good, right? And then all of a sudden, okay good is a problem, right? So no matter where we are, especially with human psychology, our brains are problem solvers. So at the end of the day, you know, all of these things are going to be naturally, it comes down to the perspective where these problems are going to arise and whether we can even solve all problems. I don't really even know what that what that even means. I mean, in terms of physics, like maybe we could figure out how light bends. And the interesting thing too is as we get more and more progressive in terms of technology, we're really going to interface more and more with. I mean, if we look at it now, we have pharmaceutical drugs. So when people feel upset, there's a chemical you can ingest, and that changes the person. It changes the individual. It changes the biology. We're already at this point where we're starting to, alter ourselves in order to solve alleged problems. Right. So now,
when you define these problems as something like external, it kind of reminds me of Maslow's hierarchy of needs in a way.
Correct. Yeah.
Of course you have, your basic needs, food, shelter, these external things, and physics, technology, or whatever, they can solve those, given it's in the interest of capitalism, or at least in this modern day and age. But there are ways to solve it. Let's assume we can have desalinization plants,
right,
to solve,
take salt out of ocean water and make it drinkable.
Yeah, make it drinkable. The only problem is that it's just too expensive, so it's not economically feasible or viable. Right. Until it becomes,
even though water's like the most valuable substance on the planet.
Right. But yeah, like when it comes to the internal psyche and the human mind, human experience, emotional intelligence, just what it takes to grow up as a person, and that honestly, I think the greatest teacher for that honestly can only be suffering in a way. Because that is the differentiator between, think of it this way. Like people who come into this country, for instance, like the H-1 visa students and such, are in a way kind of more motivated than the people who are born here and go to school there. Just because that they just have a higher level of incentive of outperforming.
They see it as a larger opportunity in a way.
Right. And kind of from that is because of their own life experiences that weren't so fortunate and great compared to what we have here in a way. So I agree that we wouldn't be able to solve all problems, probably only the external ones,
it's also, you have to define what a problem is, because at this point, we can say that we have these externalized problems in terms of war and conflict. Those are externalized problems. But when those things don't exist anymore, right now, what becomes kind of the boogeyman for, collective society? There's some sociology theories that talk about the fact that creating a externalized enemy
is what rallies people together.
Right. It creates more social cohesion. Right. So in this regard, we have to define our problems. And all of a sudden right now, it's maybe the enemy. It's another country. Right. It's whatever it is. Right. But now all of a sudden, let's say we solve those problems allegedly. Now, what becomes the enemy? What do we focus our time on? Where do we, but for me, just bringing it back maybe to the Zen perspective, it's just about cultivating peace in the self and creating harmony within the person, right? So allegedly then disharmony becomes the enemy, right? But now that can be misinterpreted because, maybe you talk to someone, you have a difficult conversation with someone, maybe that you're close to or in a relationship. It takes difficult conversations to have agreement, and all of a sudden difficult conversations may arise disharmony in the self. And now people might say, well, you're the problem, right? You're creating disharmony in me.
Right.
Therefore, you're going to make that the issue when, I think it's a part of life to have those disharmonic cycles and back and forths, right? Because it's a part of learning. It's a part of growing, suffering, again, as you said, is a part of learning. Right, to get through those things. So, negating all of those things, getting rid of allegedly all problems, like, does that just make us soft? You know what I mean? Like, if we look at like the movie WALL-E, right, where like everyone just becomes blobs and they get like, you know, moved around on, you know, computerized chairs. They don't walk, they don't run, they don't challenge themselves.
Right.
Because again, the biology only gets stronger from, you know, facing and overcoming challenges and having incentive to do so as well. You know, we became most fit when we had to chase down animals with our own hands. Right. That's what made us formidable and, like, you know, the top species, allegedly, because we forged spears and we, you know, made nets and became very creative in how we, you know, approached a herd of animals. Right. We created strategies, you know, and that in essence could be part of the catalyst as to how the human brain got so big or how it became what it became. You know what I mean? So there's kind of like that idea that, you know, we need struggle. You know, we need these things. And in terms of, like, you know, reframing that, the whole conversation here, it's like, you know, we had that idea of progression of society, right? And where is that bringing us? And at what point, you know, we need to continue to challenge ourselves to maybe face problems. We do want to solve problems, but we need to, again, be really clear on how we identify problems. How do we define what a problem is, right? Because that's going to, again, frame us to, you know, gear us to solving. What do we solve, right? I mean, especially with 8 billion people on the planet, right? What are we going to gear ourselves towards? What's the purpose, right? You know, in that regard.
It's a lot of things to unpack there. Absolutely. You know what? I suppose, you know, one of the most existential things that humans come up with is trying to, you know, their own identity, for instance. You know, I mean, that becomes apparently, like, you know, from ages 1 to 7 is like one of the most critical years for, or at least, you know, someone's own.
You're just getting imprinted, essentially. There's no interpretation because you're just first experiencing all these things.
It's like they get their first sense of self in a way. They start developing, you know, their sense of self, and then, like, apparently from 7 to 16, you know, it goes through like a whole nother level of change, you know, plus the hormones.
That'll throw you for a loop.
You know, and you know, in all the years remainder after that, you know, it's just welcome to the real world in a way, you know. And I guess this is just my own opinion, but happiness should never be the end goal. No. Because I kind of define, I think fulfillment is actually more important.
Right.
Because I would differentiate between happiness and fulfillment, as in fulfillment is basically very, very subjective to you, you know. Of course, because, you know, when you said, you know, when things go well, things can go okay, things can go well, you know, and that can be defined by whatever, you know. But, you know, having fulfillment or purpose or meaning, things like that, you know, those are things that just can't be defined by words, you know. They really do take up like the sum of someone's experience and what they go through to understand what's real and what's not, and, you know, just like appreciate, you know, the little things, and also being mindful of, you know, the bigger things out there, you know. But I guess what I'm trying to really say is, you know, as much as physics can give us an insight to the deeper knowledge and the deeper things about the universe that we don't know about, you know, like atoms studying its own atoms in a way, you know. At the same time, there are great philosophical implications behind them, like quantum mechanics and classical mechanics, relativity and such, and stuff like that. And I guess what I'm really just trying to figure a way is, how do we bridge all of that together into almost an optimized way? Of course, it would be different for everyone, right?
Yeah.
You know, how would we, in a way, and this is like where it gets hard, because I guess in neuroscience and psychology, a lot of the things you deal with are based on statistics in a way. And sometimes, things can be repeatable, and they show a similar bell curve and stuff. It's not like physics though, or like chemistry or stuff where, you have a constant or something happens, and you're able to repeat that over and over and over again. Because humans we're not just atoms, we're more than that. We have consciousness. One of the things I kind of wanted to just gloss over again was, for instance, back to like Maslow hierarchy of needs, and stuff like that. We are very, very far away from a type 1 civilization, which is basically it's basically a utopia in a way. We're like, okay, we can harness all this energy renewably, responsibly,
Right.
I mean, it could be either or, because utopia literally is subjective,
Right.
You
What's
really
perfect
can't
for one person.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It's going to be a massive culture change,
Yeah.
because it's going to fundamentally alter just behavior in a way.
Yeah. The necessity of survival
Right.
becomes not as serious.
Yeah. For instance,
more about play rather
because that hypothetically means that we, as a society, we would have the means and ability and the incentive to provide, to solve all these external problems in the way of food, shelter, water. You know what I mean? And the limit there really just becomes of, what do we do with our time and how we use it, and and things like that.
something else, I think.
And then like actualization is like
Right,
way up at the top.
Right.
And I guess it's almost what's the word? I guess it's almost a very, very rare phenomenon to someone to reach that level of self-actualization or self-realization,
Right.
because it means that everything lined up for you and you worked very, very hard for it.
Right.
And it almost becomes a self-fulfillment prophecy, And I don't mean that like as in, it was given to you. I mean that like you did everything you could to put yourself into that position, and basically become the next Elon Musk or such, actualizing on your vision, your dreams, making it happen, creating an electric car that everyone would have laughed at 15 years ago.
Right. And I think that's what self-actualization is about. It's like, you have this idea, this operating system, or this, I guess just a vision in general that you try to then bring into the world, right? And as you try to bring that into the world, right, you are fulfilling your life goal, right? So you now have influence in that external, right? As you try to change the tide, as you try to like maybe mold society, make it more efficient, make it better for other people, right? In terms of the idea of the electric car, it's like, you're now allegedly moving towards a more sustainable way of transport, things like that. So you have an influence in the world, right? Because again, it becomes down to like self and maybe society, or self and reality, right? And how we bring ourselves into that reality, right, becomes really important. Like, where do we then find ourselves having what we call in psychology like agency, where I can now become who I am in the world through the vision that I have. It becomes this kind of self-perpetual cycle, right? You know what I mean? Where you then bring yourself into that. But, you have to do a lot of introspection, I think, too, to find what you want to bring,
absolutely.
Into the world. But so
you need a lot of real world lessons.
Yeah.
You need
a lot of conscious learning, right? So I think maybe that's where we'll leave the sentiment here, and wrap this episode. We're going to keep talking, keep chatting. Like, subscribe, comment, tell us what some of your thoughts are on ancient civilization, or maybe the progression of technology and all that cool stuff. So we'll see you guys next week, and thanks for listening and watching to The Conscious Endeavor.